My name is Naomi Castellano. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a forensic auditor for a corporate consulting firm in Chicago. My job, stripped down to its actual function, is to look at a company's financial records and find the version of the truth that the official numbers were built to hide. Skimmed inventory, inflated invoices, vendors that don't exist except as a name on a check. I've spent 7 years getting very, very good at noticing when a story someone tells with numbers doesn't match the story the numbers actually tell. I want you to remember that I do this for a living because it matters enormously for what happens later in this story. My boyfriend Caleb did not remember it, or didn't think it applied to him, or simply never considered that the woman he was lying to had spent her entire adult career training for exactly this kind of lie. Let me back up further than the betrayal itself, because I think the shape of who I was before I met him explains everything about how I responded once I knew. I grew up in a household where money was discussed constantly and almost never enjoyed. My father ran a small auto parts distribution business in the suburbs of Chicago, and I spent a significant part of my adolescence watching him manage cash flow problems with the kind of low-grade, chronic anxiety that never fully resolves itself even in the good years. My mother kept the books for the business, badly for most of my childhood, until my father finally hired an actual bookkeeper when I was 16, and the difference in how the household felt within 6 months was so dramatic that I think it planted the actual seed of my career before I had any language for it. Numbers that were organized made the air in the house different. Numbers that weren't made everyone's nervous system pay for it. I studied accounting at the University of Illinois, not because it was glamorous. Nobody grows up dreaming of forensic auditing the way they dream of being a surgeon or an architect, but because I had watched firsthand what happens to a family when nobody in the house can answer the question, where did the money actually go, with any confidence. I wanted to be the person who could always answer that question, for myself first, and for other people eventually. I took my first job at a regional accounting firm at 22, moved into forensic work specifically at 26 after a senior auditor I worked under recognized something in the way I approached discrepancies, not with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of patient, total refusal to accept that's just how it's always been done, as an explanation for anything. By the time I met Caleb, I had spent 5 years finding the gaps between what companies said about their money and what their money actually did. I had testified twice in depositions related to embezzlement cases. I had a reputation at my firm, quietly earned, for being the auditor you wanted on a file when the client's story didn't quite sit right and nobody else could articulate why. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that the version of me who eventually built an 11-day case against my own boyfriend was not improvising. She was doing, with enormous personal cost, exactly the thing she'd spent a decade training to do professionally. The skill was always there. What took time was being willing to point it at someone I loved. I met Caleb Brennan at a friend's birthday dinner 2 years before any of this happened. He was 34, good-looking in the specific, slightly rumpled way of men who've never had to try particularly hard at being attractive, and he had the kind of easy, generous laugh that makes a dinner table feel warmer just by having him in it. He told me, that first night, that he was building a software platform for independent fitness instructors, a booking and payment system, something to help personal trainers and yoga instructors who didn't have the overhead for a full studio manage their own client relationships without bleeding 30% of every session to a third-party app. He talked about it with real passion. He'd clearly thought about the market. He used the phrase underserved niche without sounding like he'd memorized it off a business podcast, which, for what it's worth, he absolutely had. I liked him immediately. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters for understanding how this played out. I am not a naturally gullible person, and I still liked him immediately because he was genuinely likable. Charm isn't always a costume people wear to deceive you. Sometimes it's just charm, attached to a person who turns out to be hollow somewhere underneath it, and you don't find the hollow part until you've already let yourself love them. Our first real date was 2 weeks later, a Thursday, a small Vietnamese place he picked because he said he'd read good things, and he spent 20 minutes of that dinner asking me actual questions about my work. Not polite, glazed-over questions, but specific ones, the kind that told me he was either genuinely curious or genuinely good at performing curiosity. And at the time, I had no reason to assume it was the second thing. He asked how you prove someone moved money on purpose versus by accident. I told him intent is almost always proven through pattern, not through any single transaction. That one strange wire transfer means nothing, but 5 strange wire transfers, each individually explainable, sometimes add up to something nobody can explain away. He said that was fascinating. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a small, charming irony that he'd find that interesting. I did not think, even once, that I was explaining to him exactly how he would eventually get caught. We dated for 8 months before he asked me to move in. I did. The apartment was his lease originally, in a building near Logan Square he'd been in for 3 years, and when my lease came up for renewal around month 7, he suggested I just move my things into his place instead of resigning for another year somewhere else. It felt, at the time, like a natural and slightly overdue step. Looking back, I noticed that the apartment stayed his name on the lease even after I moved in, a detail neither of us discussed directly, and a detail that turned out to matter enormously later, though not in the direction either of us would have predicted in month 7. We dated for 14 months before the word investment entered any conversation between us, and when it did, it didn't arrive the way you'd expect, not as a business pitch, but as something softer and more dangerous than that. It arrived disguised as intimacy. It was a Tuesday night in March. We were on the couch, half watching something neither of us was paying attention to, and Caleb turned the TV off and said he wanted to talk about something real. He told me the platform. He named it FlexFlow by then, a name I privately thought was terrible but never said so out loud, had gotten real traction. He had 40 independent instructors using a beta version. He had a developer he'd been paying out of pocket who was burning through Caleb's savings faster than the product was generating revenue. He needed a real seed round to finish development, build out a proper payment processing integration, and hire a second engineer. He'd been talking to a couple of angel investors, he said, but the terms they wanted were predatory, too much equity for too little money, the kind of deal that would leave him owning a sliver of his own company by the time it actually launched. I don't want to give away my company to some guy in a hoodie who's never run a business, he said. I'd rather build this with you. We're already building a life together. Why wouldn't we build this too? I want to flag something here because I think it's the actual mechanism of how this kind of fraud works inside a relationship, and it's worth naming clearly. He never once said the word loan, and he never once said the word investment, without immediately wrapping it back around to us. The ask wasn't framed as a financial transaction. It was framed as a test of whether I believed in him, whether I was really in this relationship the way he was. Declining wasn't positioned as financially prudent. It was positioned as a referendum on whether I loved him enough. I had $85,000 in a brokerage account, money I'd built methodically over 7 years of a good salary and aggressive saving, the same way I approach everything, disciplined, automated, untouched except for the rare deliberate withdrawal. I told Caleb I needed time to think about it, and to my own surprise, I meant it in a way that felt almost like a betrayal of him, which tells you something about how effectively he'd already reframed the ask in my head. I didn't say yes that night, but I didn't say no either, and the conversation kept happening in pieces over the following 3 weeks. Never a full pitch deck, never a formal ask, just small additions every few days. A mention of a real estate listing he'd looked at for a tiny office space once we closed the round. A comment about how he'd modeled the cap table, so I'd own 30% if I put in the full amount, which sounded generous and which I now understand was a number he picked because it sounded generous, not because it was based on any actual valuation of anything. There was a night, about 10 days into this slow campaign, when he brought home a bottle of wine that was nicer than what we usually bought and told me, over dinner, that he'd been picturing the two of us 5 years from now, FlexFlow successful, both of us having built it together, telling people at parties that we'd started a company side by side. I want that to be our story, he said. Not my story with you watching from the sidelines. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else he said to me during this entire period, because it worked. It worked completely. It reframed a financial decision as a referendum on the kind of partner I wanted to be, and I have spent enough time since then thinking about why it worked on me specifically, a woman who reviews financial deception for a living, to understand that the people closest to you don't need to be more sophisticated than your job. They just need access to a different vulnerability than the one your training protects. I asked at one point whether he had a formal business plan, a financial model, Anything I could actually look at the way I'd look at it professionally rather than as his girlfriend. He said he did, that he'd send it over, and then didn't for 9 days, until I asked again, and he produced a slide deck that had clearly been thrown together the night before, projections with no sourcing, a competitive landscape slide that named 2 competitors he'd apparently never researched closely enough to get their pricing right, and a use of funds breakdown that allocated $40,000 to engineering and $20,000 to marketing and growth with no further detail than that. I should have stopped there. I want to be honest, in the interest of this being a useful story, and not just a satisfying one, that the version of me who reviews actual company financials for a living looked at that slide deck and felt something tighten in my stomach. I looked at it anyway, and decided the tightening was just nerves about giving away money, not a professional instinct flagging something real. I told myself the deck was rough because Caleb wasn't a finance person, he was a product person, and that the roughness of the paperwork didn't reflect the soundness of the underlying idea. I want anyone listening to this who's in a relationship right now and feels that same tightening to take it more seriously than I did the first time. I wired the money in April. $85,000, broken into 2 transfers per his request. Cleaner for the books, he said, into an account for an LLC called FlexFlow Technologies that he'd set up the month before. For about 6 weeks, everything looked exactly the way he described it. He talked about onboarding the developer full-time. He mentioned a meeting with a payment processor. He came home some nights legitimately exhausted in the specific way people are exhausted by real work, and I want to be fair here. I don't think every single thing Caleb told me during this period was a lie. I think some of FlexFlow was real, in the sense that there probably was a beta product and probably were 40 instructors using it. The lie wasn't necessarily the company's existence. The lie was what the money was actually for. I went with him, once, to a small meetup of fitness industry founders he'd found through a Facebook group, mostly out of curiosity about whether the world he described actually existed outside our living room. It did, more or less. There were real instructors there. 2 of them recognized the FlexFlow name and asked him technical questions about the booking interface that he answered fluently. I remember feeling, that night, a small wave of relief. See, this is real, you're being paranoid. And I think that night did more than almost anything else to delay my suspicion because it gave me a concrete, sensory memory to point to whenever a smaller doubt surfaced later. The mind does that. It collects one piece of solid feeling evidence and uses it to discount everything that comes after, even when the later evidence is, on paper, far stronger. The first thing that didn't sit right happened in late May. Caleb mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd flown to Austin for a few days to meet with a potential partner for the platform's expansion into the Texas market. I asked which partner. He said it was still early, he didn't want to jinx it by naming names, and I let it go, because that's a reasonable thing for an early-stage founder to say, and I had no specific reason yet to disbelieve him. The second thing happened in June. I was doing what I always do with our shared accounts, not snooping exactly, just the routine financial housekeeping I do for every account I'm attached to, professional habit bleeding into personal life, and I noticed a charge on a credit card we shared for household expenses. A hotel booking, 4 nights, in Denpasar, Bali. $1,100. Caleb hadn't mentioned a trip to Bali. I asked him about it that night, casually, the way you ask about something you assume has an obvious explanation. He said it was a mistake, that he'd accidentally used the wrong card for a work trip he was taking the following month, a conference related to FlexFlow, and that he'd transfer the money back to cover it immediately. I said okay. I want you to notice, the way I eventually noticed myself, how fast and how specific that explanation was. People who are telling the truth about an accidental charge usually need a second to remember what the charge even was. Caleb had the whole story ready before I'd finished the question. He did transfer the money back 2 days later, which, in retrospect, told me less about his honesty and more about how carefully he was managing the optics of every individual data point, one at a time, as they came up. He was good at this. I want to give him that in the coldest possible sense. He was good at managing each individual question as it surfaced, which only works as a strategy if the person asking never steps back and looks at the whole pattern at once. There's a particular quality to gaslighting that happens inside a financially intertwined relationship that I think is worth naming because it's different from the more commonly discussed emotional version. Every time Caleb cleanly resolved one of these small discrepancies, transferring money back, producing a fast explanation, it didn't just neutralize that specific question. It also, subtly, made me feel slightly embarrassed for having asked it. I started, without fully realizing it, pre-editing my own questions to sound less suspicious, softening them, framing them as idle curiosity rather than the actual scrutiny they were. That's the part of this I think people underestimate about financial deception between partners. It doesn't just hide the money. It trains the person being deceived to ask worse questions. I started looking at the whole pattern at once in July, and I want to walk you through exactly how because I think the method matters more than the conclusion. I am a forensic auditor. The entire discipline of forensic accounting rests on one principle that I apply to corporate fraud investigations every single week of my professional life. People are bad at lying consistently across multiple, disconnected data sources because they don't think about their lies as a complete system. They think about each lie individually, in the moment it's needed, to solve the specific problem in front of them. The Austin trip and the Bali hotel charge were, individually, two perfectly survivable conversations. Together, cross-referenced against a timeline, they were the beginning of a pattern. The specific moment I decided to stop treating these as isolated incidents happened on a Sunday afternoon in early July. Caleb had gone out for a run and I was doing dishes and I found myself, unprompted, recalling the Austin trip and the Bali charge in the same thought, back to back for the first time, not because anything new had happened, but because some part of my professional brain had finally been given enough raw material to start pattern matching on its own, the way it does at work when a file that's been sitting untouched for weeks suddenly clicks into a shape I can see. I stood at the sink with my hands still wet and thought, that's 2 trips in 2 months that don't fully make sense, and I have only heard about either of them because of an accident, not because he told me. I pulled, and I want to be clear, these were our shared accounts I had every legal right to review, not anything I accessed without authorization, 6 months of statements across every card and account Caleb and I had any joint visibility into. I built a simple spreadsheet, the same kind of thing I'd build for a client engagement, with columns for date, amount, description, and a notes column where I logged what explanation, if any, Caleb had given me for each transaction at the time it occurred. The Austin trip, when I looked at the actual charges associated with it instead of just the story he'd told me, included 2 dinners billed for parties of 2 at restaurants that were not, by any reasonable interpretation, business meeting restaurants. One was a rooftop bar with a minimum spend, the other an Italian place known locally as a date night spot. I am not saying every business dinner has to look a certain way. I am saying that when you cross-reference a potential partner meeting against a receipt for 2 glasses of a wine that retails for $90 a bottle and a tip that suggested real warmth toward the server, the story starts to strain. I also went back and looked at his calendar. We shared a household calendar app for scheduling things like the cleaning service and dinner plans with friends, another piece of shared infrastructure he seemed to have forgotten existed, and found that the Austin trip had been blocked out as FlexFlow, partner MTGS, plural, with no further detail for 3 days, but his actual flight, which I cross-referenced against an email confirmation still sitting in our joint trip planning folder from when we used to plan vacations together, showed him landing the evening of day 1 and departing the morning of day 3, which left a single full day unaccounted for inside a trip he described as requiring 3. The thing that broke it open completely was a single-line item I almost missed, buried in a statement from FlexFlow's own business account, an account I had access to as a 30% equity holder, which Caleb seemed to have forgotten, or assumed I'd never actually check, because why would the girlfriend audit the company books instead of just trusting her boyfriend? A withdrawal of $19,000 transferred from the FlexFlow business account into Caleb's personal checking account in early May, 3 weeks after I'd wired my investment. The memo line, generated automatically by the bank's transfer system based on the account nickname he'd set up, read, "Transfer to personal, Q2 travel/miscellaneous. $19,000. Out of $85,000 I'd put in. Labeled, by his own account system, as travel and miscellaneous." I sat with that line item open on my laptop for almost 20 minutes before I did anything else. I remember the specific physical sensation of it, not panic exactly, More like the floor of a building settling slightly, the kind of structural shift you only notice because you've spent your whole career trained to notice exactly that kind of shift in other people's buildings. I pulled his personal checking account next. Again, an account I had legitimate shared visibility into since we'd linked our budgeting app together early in the relationship, a detail that I think Caleb had simply forgotten existed, the way people forget the small infrastructure of intimacy they built in easier days. 2 days after that $19,000 transfer, a charge appeared for a round-trip business class flight to Denpasar. Not the same hotel booking from the credit card mistake in June, a separate trip in May that I hadn't known about at all because it hadn't touched any account I was actively monitoring at the time. Booked for 2 passengers. I sat with my laptop open on our kitchen counter for a long time before I did the next thing, which was find out who the second passenger was. It wasn't hard. Caleb is not, it turns out, a careful man in the way that matters most. He is careful about managing individual conversations in real time, and almost completely careless about the digital trail those conversations leave behind. The airline's loyalty program had both names on the booking confirmation email, which I found because I still had access to a shared email folder we'd set up for trip planning back when we were the kind of couple who planned trips together. The second name was Brielle Tanaka. I recognized the name immediately because Caleb had mentioned her exactly once, 18 months earlier, in the early careful honesty phase of a new relationship where you tell each other about your exes in broad, sanitized strokes. Brielle was the girlfriend before me. 3 years together, ended about 8 months before he and I met. He described the breakup as mutual, calm, nothing dramatic. We just grew apart, he'd said, the kind of sentence that means nothing and is designed to mean nothing. I want to pause here and tell you something I didn't expect to feel in that moment, which was an almost professional curiosity layered directly on top of the personal devastation, the two sensations running in parallel rather than one replacing the other. The auditor in me was already asking, how long has this been going on, and how much of it touched the money I gave him? The rest of me was simply sitting at a kitchen counter trying to remember how to breathe normally. Both of those things were happening to the same person at the same time, and I think that's actually a more accurate description of what discovering a betrayal feels like than the version where you just collapse cleanly into grief. Grief and forensic clarity, for me, arrived together, and I let the forensic clarity drive for a while because it was the only part of me still capable of standing up straight. I did not confront Caleb that night. I want to walk through exactly what I did instead, because I think it's the part of the story that actually matters, more than the discovery itself. I am trained to build a complete, defensible record before I ever present a finding to a client, because an incomplete accusation gives the subject of an investigation room to maneuver, to explain away each piece in isolation the same way Caleb had been explaining away each piece in isolation for months. I was not going to hand him that same advantage twice. I spent the next 11 days doing what I do professionally, except the company under investigation was my own relationship. I pulled every transaction across every account I had legitimate access to, the joint household card, the budgeting app, FlexFlow's business account, even Caleb's personal rewards program logins that auto-saved in our shared browser, which felt invasive in a way that made me genuinely uncomfortable until I reminded myself that he had spent $85,000 of my dollars, and the discomfort of looking was a much smaller cost than the discomfort of not knowing. During those 11 days, I continued living with Caleb in a state of what I can only describe as professional surveillance wrapped around ordinary domestic life. We ate dinner together most nights. We watched television. He told me, twice during that period, that things at FlexFlow were really coming together, and both times I said something neutral and supportive and went back, an hour later, to the spreadsheet open on my laptop in another room. I want to be honest that this was one of the harder parts of the entire ordeal, not the discovery itself, but the 11 days of performing a version of normalcy while privately reconstructing the exact shape of his dishonesty, line by line. There's a particular loneliness to investigating someone you still, in some unprocessed corner of yourself, love. What I found, assembled fully, was this. Of the $85,000 I'd invested in FlexFlow Technologies, roughly $31,000 had gone toward things that plausibly resembled the business he described, a payment to a freelance developer whose invoices I could verify against a real contractor profile, a modest software subscription cost, a small amount spent on a co-working space membership. The remaining $54,000 traced across personal transfers, credit card charges, and a second smaller cash withdrawal I found in August had gone toward the May trip to Bali with Brielle Tanaka, including business class flights, a 5-night stay at a resort that ran nearly $900 a night, and what appeared to be a significant piece of jewelry purchased at a shop in Seminyak that I confirmed through a quick reverse search of the receipts listed business. Specialized in custom engagement and commitment rings, a second, shorter trip to Nashville in July that I could find no business justification for at all, and that included 2 tickets to a concert, and a pattern of cash withdrawals from the FlexFlow account, each one just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic bank reporting flag that I could not trace to any specific destination but that, cumulatively, totaled almost $11,000. I want to spend a moment on that structuring pattern specifically, because it's the detail that told me the most about who Caleb actually was underneath the charm. Structuring cash withdrawals to stay under a reporting threshold isn't something a careless person does by accident. It requires knowing the threshold exists and deliberately working beneath it. Whatever Caleb told himself about his own intentions during this period, some part of him understood, clearly enough to act on it, that what he was doing wouldn't survive scrutiny, which meant some part of him had decided, deliberately, that scrutiny was the thing to avoid rather than the dishonesty itself. I built all of this into a single document. Dates, amounts, source accounts, destination accounts, cross-referenced against the explanations Caleb had given me, in writing where I had them, texts, emails, and in my own contemporaneous notes where I didn't. I treated my own relationship with the same rigor I'd apply to a corporate embezzlement case, because that rigor was the only thing standing between me and being talked out of what the evidence plainly showed. I also did one more thing that I think mattered enormously to how the eventual confrontation went. I had a friend who practiced family and civil law review the documentation, not because I was certain I wanted to pursue anything legally, but because I wanted to understand, clearly, what my actual options were before I ever sat down with Caleb. Her name was Renee, and she'd been my closest friend since college, and I remember sitting across from her at her kitchen table while she read through everything in near total silence, occasionally making a small sound that wasn't quite a word. When she finished, she sat back and said, "I need you to know I'm furious on your behalf before I give you the lawyer answer." "I know," I said. "Give me the lawyer answer anyway." She told me that an investment obtained under false pretenses, where the funds were represented as going toward one purpose and were instead diverted to personal use, could potentially constitute fraud, and that depending on how the LLC's operating agreement was structured, I likely had grounds for both a civil claim to recover the funds and, depending on what a prosecutor wanted to do with it, a criminal referral for the diversion of investor funds. "Do you want this to be a relationship conversation or a legal one?" she asked me. "I want it to be both, in the right order," I said. "I want him to know I know everything before either one starts." I told Caleb I wanted to take him to dinner on a Friday night in early September at a restaurant we'd gone to on one of our first real dates, the kind of place with low lighting and a wine list that made him feel sophisticated. I told him I had some good news to share about a promotion at work. This was true. I had, in fact, just been promoted to senior forensic auditor, and I let that be the actual reason for the dinner reservation because I wanted him relaxed, and because I had genuinely decided, somewhere in the previous 11 days, that I was done managing my own emotions around his comfort. I dressed carefully that evening, not for him, but for myself. I wanted to feel, walking into that restaurant, like the most composed and capable version of myself, because I knew I would need every bit of that composure for what came after the entrees arrived. I remember sitting in the car outside the restaurant for 2 extra minutes before going in, running through the order of what I planned to say, the same way I'd rehearse a presentation before walking into a client meeting. We ordered. We talked about my promotion, and he was warm and complimentary in the specific, slightly performative way I'd started to notice underneath everything else he did, generous with praise in a way that always circled back, eventually, to something about himself. He told me this was huge for us, and I noted, internally, the particular cruelty of that specific word choice without yet saying anything about it. About 20 minutes in, after our entrees arrived, I set my fork down and pulled a folder out of my bag. I want to talk about FlexFlow, I said. He smiled, easy, unbothered.
Sure.
What's up? Things are actually looking really good right now. I know about Bali, I said. I watched his face very carefully in the half-second after I said it, because I'd spent 11 days preparing for this exact moment, and I wanted to see, clinically, what his first unguarded reaction actually was before he had time to build a response around it. What I saw was not confusion. It was the specific, fast recalculation of someone running through, in real time, which version of an excuse might still work. Naomi, that was a work trip, I told you. I have the booking confirmation with Brielle Tanaka's name on it, I said. I have the $19,000 transfer from FlexFlow's business account to your personal checking account, made 3 weeks after I wired my investment. I have the credit card statements from the second trip to Bali in June that you told me was a mistake. I have the Nashville trip in July. I have $11,000 in cash withdrawals from the business account that I can't account for at all, which means you might not be able to either, when someone less generous than me asks you to. He went very quiet. The waiter came by to ask if everything was okay with the food, and Caleb said yes, fine, in a voice that had nothing left in it, and the waiter left, and neither of us touched our plates again. It's not what it looks like, he finally said. What does it look like, in your version? I asked. Because in my version, I gave you $85,000 to build a company, and you used over half of it to take your ex-girlfriend to Bali, buy what looks like a ring at a jewelry shop while you were there, take her again to a concert in Nashville, and pull cash out of the business in amounts specifically structured to stay under a reporting threshold. I genuinely like to hear the version where that's not what happened. He didn't have one. I want to tell you that plainly because I think there's a temptation in stories like this to give the other person one good redemptive line, a moment where they say something that explains the inexplicable in a way that makes them human again.
Caleb didn't have that line.
What he had, instead, was a series of half-starts. Brielle and I reconnected. It wasn't supposed to turn into anything. The business stuff was real. I was going to pay you back once things picked up. That didn't add up to an explanation so much as a slow, public unraveling of a story he'd never actually built to withstand scrutiny, because he'd never imagined anyone would scrutinize it. How long? I asked him. Has it actually been happening? Not how long since the first trip. How long since you started talking to her again? He was quiet for a moment.
About a year, he said.
Around when I started really pushing on the FlexFlow round.
I sat with that. A year.
He had reconnected with Brielle around the same time he'd started the slow, patient campaign to get my $85,000, and I don't think that timing was a coincidence, even if Caleb himself had never consciously connected the two threads in his own head. I think a man who is quietly rebuilding a relationship he hasn't fully let go of is also, often without admitting it to himself, looking for the resources to fund the rebuilding, and I happen to be sitting right there with exactly the resources he needed. Are you engaged to her? I asked, because the jewelry receipt had been sitting in my folder for 11 days, and I needed the answer before I decided what came next.
No, he said.
I bought it. We haven't talked about it yet. I don't know what I was thinking. I think you knew exactly what you were thinking, I said. I think you were thinking you wanted to go back to a relationship that ended before we met, and you used my money to pay for the reunion because you didn't have any of your own left to spend on it. I did not throw a drink in his face. I did not raise my voice in that restaurant, though I understood, watching other tables glance over once or twice, that something in my stillness was probably more unsettling to him than volume would have been. I told him, calmly, exactly what was going to happen next. I told him I expected full repayment of the $54,000 that had no legitimate connection to the business, on a schedule, in writing, and that I had already consulted an attorney about my options if that didn't happen voluntarily. I told him I had documented everything, that the documentation existed in multiple places he had no access to, and that if he tried to claim later that the money had genuinely gone toward FlexFlow, the bank records would simply prove otherwise to anyone who looked the same way they'd proven it to me. I told him I was moving out within 30 days, regardless of how the financial conversation went, and that I expected him to find somewhere else to live in the meantime if that timeline was a problem for him, since the apartment lease was in my name alone, a detail I had insisted on 18 months earlier, for reasons that had felt like simple practicality at the time and that I was now deeply, quietly grateful for. I had insisted on the lease being in my name when we'd renewed it the previous year, mostly because my credit profile was stronger and it had gotten us a better rate, a decision that had felt entirely unromantic and administrative at the time, and that turned out, 18 months later, to be the single most consequential piece of foresight I had ever exercised in that relationship without realizing it. The drive home from that restaurant happened in near total silence. Caleb tried, twice, to start a sentence, and I told him both times that I wasn't ready to talk in the car, that I needed to get home first, and he respected that, which I noted, with a kind of distant, clinical interest, as possibly the first time in the relationship he'd ever fully respected a boundary I set without trying to negotiate it first. That night, after he'd gone to sleep in the guest room, a room that had, until that day, mostly held boxes, I sat at the kitchen table and texted Renee a single line. Asterisk, I did it. He didn't have an answer. Asterisk, she called me back within 2 minutes even though it was past midnight, and we talked for almost an hour, mostly about nothing important, the kind of conversation that exists purely to keep you company inside the wreckage rather than to solve anything. He tried, over the following 2 weeks, several different versions of getting out of the financial obligation. First, that the LLC structure meant my investment was simply lost the way any investment can be lost, no fraud involved, just bad luck. Then that he genuinely intended to pay the personal expenses back out of FlexFlow's eventual revenue. As though the company surviving long enough to generate that revenue was a real possibility, rather than a fantasy he was still performing out of habit. He sent me, at one point, a long text message, I still have it saved, explaining that he'd never meant for it to go this far with Brielle, that he genuinely loved me, that the money situation had spiraled in a way he hadn't planned. I read it twice and did not respond, because I had nothing useful to say back to a message that was, at its core, asking me to manage his guilt for him one more time. My attorney's letter, when it finally went out, cut through both of those versions cleanly. The funds had been solicited under a specific stated purpose, diverted to personal and demonstrably unrelated use, and documented thoroughly enough that any claim to the contrary would not survive a courtroom, let alone a conversation between two people who both already knew the truth. We settled, ultimately, without going to court, because Caleb's family, his parents, when they found out what he'd actually done with the money, which he eventually had to disclose to them when he needed to borrow from them to cover it, were horrified enough to insist on a clean resolution rather than risk a public legal proceeding with their name anywhere near it. I never spoke to his parents directly during this period, but Renee, who'd stayed in occasional touch with his mother from a mutual friend group years earlier, told me secondhand that his mother had said, on hearing the full account, I raised him better than this, which I believed completely, and which did nothing to undo what had happened, because raising someone better than something is not the same as them actually being better.
Not when it counts.
He repaid the full $54,000 over 14 months, in amounts his parents largely covered directly, which told me everything about who had actually been managing his finances his whole life and who would presumably go on managing them after I was gone. FlexFlow folded within the year. I don't know what happened with Brielle. I genuinely never asked, and Caleb never offered, in the handful of logistical conversations we still had to have about the move-out and the repayment schedule. I moved into a new apartment that fall, smaller than what I'd had with Caleb, but entirely mine, no shared lease, no shared accounts, no folder of evidence required to know what was actually happening inside my own home. The first night in that apartment, with most of my furniture still in boxes, I sat on the floor with a glass of wine and felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, which was relief that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with simplicity. Nobody else's name was on anything. Every account I checked from that point forward told me only the truth about my own life, because there was no one else's story tangled into the numbers. I went back to work the Monday after the dinner, walked into my office, and finished a corporate embezzlement case I'd been building for 3 months, the kind of work that, for the first time in a while, felt almost restful by comparison, a fraud with no feelings attached to it, just numbers that didn't add up and a person who'd eventually have to explain why. My manager, who knew nothing about my personal life and had no reason to, told me that quarter that my closing rate on disputed fund cases was the highest on the team, and I remember almost laughing out loud in the hallway because I had never in my life had quite so much unpaid practice for the job as I'd just had at home. I started seeing someone new about 8 months later, a structural engineer named David who I met through Renee's husband, and on our third date, when the subject of past relationships inevitably came up, I told him a short, factual version of what had happened with Caleb, not because I was performing openness, but because I decided somewhere in the previous 8 months that I was no longer going to soften or shrink a true story just to make it easier for a new person to sit across from
Me.
David listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, I have a financial advisor friend. Remind me never to let you two compare notes about me, which was such a strange, specific, slightly nervous joke that I laughed for real. The first time talking about Caleb had produced something other than the flat, clinical recitation I'd perfected by then. I think about the tightening in my stomach the first time I looked at his slide deck, back in March, more than I think about almost anything else from that relationship. I had the instinct. I had the training. I overrode both because I wanted, very badly, for the man across from me to be exactly who he'd presented himself as being. I don't think that makes me foolish. I think it makes me someone who, like most people, occasionally wants the audit to come back clean more than she wants it to come back accurate. It rarely does both. That's the whole job. That's the whole lesson. That's my story. One investment. One trip to Bali that wasn't mine. 11 days of building a file on the man I loved, the same way I'd build one on a stranger, because the numbers, in the end, don't care how much you love the person whose name is attached to them. And one apartment, entirely my own, where the only story the accounts have ever told is true.